Normandy, June 1944. The rain has stopped, but the mud remembers. A U.S. paratrooper crouches behind the shattered frame of a French house farm, his rifle jammed, his breath uneven. The battle has turned to whispers, boots in the dark, shadows in the hedgerows. He reaches for the sidearm on his hip. The weight is familiar. Cold, heavy steel, worn smooth by 100 draws. The engraving reads, Colt Automatic Caliber 45. He thumbs the safety off. One motion, one sound. The slide snaps forward with the same confidence it had when his father carried it in 1918. A single enemy soldier appears through the smoke. 2 shots echo, deep, percussive, final. The 45 stops him instantly. When the paratrooper exhales, he isn't thinking about history or design, only that his pistol worked again. This pistol was officially obsolete before this war even began, yet in the hands of men like him, it became one of the most trusted weapons of the entire conflict and beyond. This is the story of the Colt M1911, the pistol too old to retire and too perfect to replace. The story of America's most enduring sidearm begins not in the factories of wartime, but decades earlier in a humid, distant jungle where a different pistol had failed its men. It was the dawn of the 20th century. The United States had emerged from the Spanish-American War, a rising power with global ambitions. By 1899, it was fighting a brutal counterinsurgency in the Philippines against determined Filipino guerrillas. These fighters, often charging at close range, exposed the grim weakness of the U.S. Army's issued sidearm, the .38 Long Colt revolver. Reports filtered back of soldiers emptying entire cylinders into attackers who kept coming. The Army needed something stronger, a pistol that could stop a man with certainty, every time. Enter John Moses Browning, a name already legendary among gunmakers. By 1904, Browning and Colt were developing a self-loading pistol chambered in a new round, the .45 automatic Colt pistol. Heavy, slow, and devastating. It was everything the .38 wasn't. In 1907, the U.S. Army began official trials to find its next service pistol. The requirements were punishing. The gun had to fire 6,000 rounds without critical failure. It had to be disassembled easily, cleaned quickly, and remain accurate under harsh conditions. Browning's prototype, a steel-framed, recoil-operated automatic with a 7-round magazine, entered the field. Competing designs came from Savage, Luger, and others. The trials were exhaustive. Each pistol was fired until components broke, barrels overheated, or slides jammed. When the smoke cleared in 1911, Browning's Colt stood virtually unscathed. After thousands of rounds, it continued to function. The Ordnance Department was convinced. On March 29, 1911, the U.S. Army officially adopted it as the automatic pistol, caliber .45, M1911. It was a milestone, not just for the Army, but for small arms design itself. The pistol's internal mechanics were simple yet brilliant. A short recoil system that absorbed the violent energy of the .45 ACP, redirecting it into a smooth cycle of ejection and chambering. The single-action trigger and manual safety made it both fast and deliberate, a soldier's weapon that demanded respect. When America entered World War I in 1917, the M1911 went with it. In the mud of the Western Front, the pistol's reputation hardened. Doughboys carried it in the trenches, tankers kept it as a last resort, and officers found it more than symbolic. Reports from France described it as a man's gun, its heavy recoil a reminder of its stopping power. Its users swore by it. Sergeant Alvin York, later awarded the Medal of Honor, used his M1911 during his legendary single-handed capture of over 130 German soldiers. He later wrote that it never failed me. By the armistice in 1918, the M1911 had become part of the American military identity. It was issued to officers, machine gunners, tank crews, and pilots, any soldier whose duties might bring combat too close for a rifle. More than 600,000 were produced during the Great War. But peace brought change. When the guns fell silent, so did production. The interwar period saw the U.S. Army shrink, budgets collapse, and interest in new sidearms fade. By the late 1920s, the M1911 seemed destined to remain a relic of its war, a tool built for a conflict no one wanted to repeat. And yet, quietly, it endured. Police departments adopted it. Civilian shooters praised its accuracy. Gunsmiths refined its contours into what became the M1911A1, introduced in 1926, featuring a shorter trigger, arched mainspring housing, and improved sights. Still, by the late 1930s, many within the U.S. military considered the pistol dated. Across the Atlantic, new European designs, Luger, Walther, and Browning's own high power, were lighter, faster, and carried more rounds. The M1911 was heavy, old-fashioned, expensive to build. But history was about to make it essential again. Because as Europe descended into war in 1939, and America prepared for the unthinkable, the Army needed sidearms, millions of them. And only one design was proven, trusted, and ready to build. The same pistol that had fought in the mud of France was about to fight again, on beaches, jungles, and deserts across the world.
By the time the United States entered the Second World War in December 1941, the M1911 was already 3 decades old. Its design predated tanks, aircraft carriers, and radar. Yet it was about to equip the most powerful army ever assembled. America's entry into the war triggered a mobilization unlike anything in history. Factories shifted overnight from peacetime production to an arsenal economy. Typewriters became machine guns. Sewing machines became airplane parts. And among the urgent priorities listed by the Ordnance Department was a simple directive: produce pistols, as many as possible, as fast as possible. But Colt, the original manufacturer, couldn't do it alone. The government turned to American industry at large. Contracts went out to Remington Rand, Ithaca Gun Company, Union Switch and Signal, and even Singer Sewing Machine Company. Each was tasked with producing the M1911A1, the improved wartime model standardized for mass manufacture. The result was industrial harmony on a national scale. By 1943, these companies were turning out tens of thousands of pistols every month. Tooling tolerances were so precise that slides from an Ithaca could fit seamlessly on a Colt frame, a remarkable feat for 1940s machining. The pistol itself had changed only slightly. The A1 variant featured minor ergonomic refinements: shorter trigger, improved grip safety, arched mainspring housing. But its soul remained pure Browning. Soldiers from both world wars could swap holsters and hardly notice the difference. And in an era obsessed with progress, with automatic rifles and submachine guns reshaping battlefields, the 1911's survival was almost an act of defiance. It was heavy, with just 7 rounds in its magazine. It required strength to handle and training to master. Yet every man who carried it understood its value: reliability, simplicity, and absolute stopping power. The Army issued the M1911A1 broadly to officers, tank crews, machine gunners, and paratroopers. In the tight confines of armored vehicles or aircraft cockpits, a pistol wasn't secondary, it was essential. In the Pacific, Marines favored it for close-quarters combat, where its .45 ACP round proved decisive against determined Japanese infantry. Field reports praised the pistol's ruggedness. Sand, mud, rain, none of it seemed to matter. A soldier could drop his Colt into the surf, shake it out, and fire again. The design's generous clearances, often criticized in peacetime for imprecision, now worked in its favor. By 1942, nearly every American combat unit carried the 1911 in some form. Colt itself produced roughly 400,000 during the war. Remington Rand over 900,000. Ithaca 335,000. Even Singer's limited run of 500 pistols became collector's legends. To understand why this obsolete weapon endured, one must look beyond specifications. The 1911 was more than a firearm. It was an anchor of familiarity in an uncertain war. Many older soldiers had trained with it before. Officers who'd served between the wars knew its quirks and trustworthiness. For recruits, it represented continuity, a weapon proven by their father's generation. And symbolically, it fit the American ethos. It wasn't refined or continental. It was industrial, muscular, decisive, the sidearm of a nation that valued reliability over elegance. Meanwhile, Europe's pistols reflected different philosophies. The German P-38 favored complexity and precision. The British Enfield revolver, tradition and simplicity. The 1911 struck a balance few others managed. A fighting pistol, not a showpiece. By mid-war, production numbers soared. The U.S. government issued over 2.5 million M1911 and M1911A1 pistols by 1945. No other semi-automatic handgun had ever been fielded on that scale. And as American troops spread across the globe, from Tunisia's deserts to the hedgerows of Normandy, from the Solomon Islands to the ruins of Berlin, so did the pistol's legend. It became an extension of the man carrying it, close, personal, utterly dependable. For many soldiers, it wasn't just a weapon, it was insurance when everything else failed. And that bond between man and machine, forged in the intensity of battle, would define the 1911's legacy for generations. Its story now shifts from origins and factories to the field, where steel, sweat, and instinct met on the front lines, and the pistol proved why age could be an advantage.
War is not only about machinery, it's about trust. And few weapons in modern history inspired more trust than the Colt M1911. The human angle, a soldier's companion. For millions of Americans fighting across two oceans, the 1911 was more than a sidearm. It was the last line between life and death. Infantrymen wrote home about it. Tank crews slept beside it, and paratroopers carried it close to their chest, tied to a lanyard lest it fall away mid-jump. Its sound was unmistakable, a deep, authoritative crack, far lower in pitch than the sharp reports of German 9mm pistols. When it fired, soldiers said you could feel the hit. Many who carried it spoke of confidence, not because it was pretty or modern, but because it worked. Through grit, blood, sand, or rain, the M1911 kept firing. It was forgiving, tolerant of neglect, and brutally effective at close range. In the Pacific, Marines praised it as the equalizer in close combat. Against enemy soldiers known for close-quarters attacks, its .45 ACP round, slow, heavy, and designed for maximum transfer of energy, was trusted absolutely. If you hit them, "They go down," one Marine corporal wrote in 1943. The recoil was sharp, the grip thick, and the weight substantial, nearly 2.5 pounds loaded. But that heft gave reassurance. Soldiers said it felt right. In a world of uncertainty, the pistol's cold steel was something solid to hold. Those who survived battles often kept their issued sidearms long after. It wasn't sentimentality, it was memory. The pistol had become a companion, a symbol of survival, of the moments when everything else failed, but one trigger pull changed the outcome. The technological angle, perfection by design. From an engineering standpoint, the 1911 was an exercise in elegant function. John Browning's genius lay not in complexity, but in simplicity, in designing a system that balanced immense power with mechanical harmony. The pistol's operation was based on short recoil. When fired, the barrel and slide recoiled together a short distance before the barrel tilted downward, unlocking and allowing the slide to continue rearward. This motion ejected the spent casing and cocked the hammer. A return spring then drove the slide forward, chambering the next round. Every part served a purpose, and every purpose served reliability. It could be stripped down in seconds with no tools, a vital feature for soldiers in the field. Its large tolerances, often mocked by engineers used to tight European precision, allowed dirt and carbon to accumulate without seizing the mechanism. The 45 ACP round it fired had been born from combat necessity. After the failures of the .38 long Colt, U.S. military testing demanded a bullet with proven stopping power. Browning's new cartridge delivered. A 230-grain projectile traveling at subsonic speed, designed not for penetration, but for energy transfer. It didn't just wound, it stopped threats immediately. At a time when European militaries were embracing smaller, faster rounds, the German 9mm, the Italian 765mm, the French 765 long, the U.S. stood alone with its philosophy. One powerful hit was better than 3 weaker ones. And in battle, that difference was felt. Reports from the Pacific and Europe alike recorded enemy soldiers brought down instantly by a single .45 slug. German medics often described the wound channel as catastrophic, wide, deep, and beyond recovery at short distances. Yet for all its power, the M1911 remained controllable. The single-action trigger broke cleanly, allowing accurate shots even under stress. Its ergonomics, grip angle, balance, and sight alignment were nearly perfect from the start. So perfect, in fact, that modern pistols still mimic them more than a century later. The design's longevity defies logic in an age of constant reinvention. While firearms evolved, polymer frames, striker-fired systems, lightweight alloys, the M1911's silhouette never truly disappeared, because from a functional standpoint, it had already achieved equilibrium. The psychological angle, confidence and identity. Weapons carry symbols, and the 1911 became an emblem of the American fighting spirit, practical, durable, unpretentious. To carry it was to hold a piece of history. The men who had stormed the trenches in 1918 had trusted this same gun. To the new generation in World War II, that lineage mattered. It meant reliability wasn't theory, it was proven in the worst conditions imaginable. There's a reason photos of GIs in every theater, from Normandy to Okinawa, often show the same shape at their side. The squared frame, the short barrel, the wooden grips. It was as recognizable as the M1 Garand or the Sherman tank. The 1911 wasn't just a sidearm, it was part of the national image. In the hands of soldiers, aviators, and Marines, it came to represent American persistence, the idea that effectiveness mattered more than innovation for its own sake. Even the act of loading it had ritual weight. The magazine, 7 rounds of brass and lead, locked in with a click that sounded final. The slide's motion, heavy and mechanical, ended in a single metallic snap. That sound echoed confidence. For young soldiers, it was reassurance. For veterans, it was continuity. And in war, that kind of faith in your weapon wasn't technical. It was emotional. The 1911, designed in an age of cavalry and bolt-action rifles, was now helping to liberate continents. It wasn't supposed to last this long, but its simplicity, power, and dependability turned outdated into irreplaceable. And as production ramped up and new hands took hold of old steel, the weapon's story expanded beyond individuals into the realm of industry, enemies, and command.
The industrial angle, America's arsenal of democracy. When the United States went to war in 1941, the Colt M1911 wasn't just a weapon, it became a blueprint for American industrial power. The pistol's survival into the Second World War wasn't merely due to its design, but because the nation could produce it at scale with unmatched precision. Colt's original Hartford factory couldn't hope to meet wartime demand. The government needed sidearms for millions of servicemen, so the Ordnance Department distributed contracts across the industrial map. Companies that had never made firearms were now part of a synchronized production network. Remington Rand, known for typewriters, became the largest producer, over 900,000 pistols. Ithaca Gun Company, once famous for shotguns, contributed another 335,000. Union Switch and Signal, a railroad equipment manufacturer, added merely 55,000. Even Singer Sewing Machine Company, whose tolerances were legendary, built a limited run of about 500, masterpieces of precision, today worth small fortunes to collectors. These weren't isolated factories, but nodes in a vast wartime ecosystem. Parts were standardized, tolerances unified, blueprints shared under military supervision. A slide made in Pennsylvania could fit perfectly onto a frame built in Connecticut. It was mechanical democracy, interchangeable craftsmanship across industries that had never collaborated before. In this sense, the M1911 wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol of how America fought its wars, through unity, mass production, and technical discipline. The logistical challenge was staggering. Each pistol required dozens of machined parts, each milled, polished, heat-treated, and assembled by hand. Yet, output soared. Between 1941 and 1945, American industry produced over 2.5 million M1911 and M1911A1 pistols. The weapon's industrial story is as American as the weapon itself, the triumph of production as strategy. And behind every stamped serial number was a philosophy that reliability in war began not just with soldiers, but with factories that never slept. The enemy angle, how the Axis saw it. To America's enemies, the M1911 was both feared and respected. German and Japanese forces encountered it repeatedly in battle, and recognized immediately that this old pistol was unlike the sidearms they carried. The Wehrmacht issued the Walther P38 and the Luger P08, both chambered in 9mm parabellum, faster firing but lighter in punch. The Japanese Imperial Army relied on the Nambu pistol, an elegant design yet prone to jamming in mud and cold. When Allied troops captured Axis sidearms, many found them finely made but delicate, too dependent on clean conditions. Conversely, Axis troops who got their hands on an M1911 were often reluctant to give it up. Captured reports note German officers carrying them as personal trophies, describing the 45 as a brutal but efficient weapon. In the Pacific, Japanese soldiers learned to fear its distinctive report. In close-quarter encounters, particularly during assaults on American positions, the 45 ACP round was notorious. Stories circulated among Marines that enemy soldiers, often wearing layers of equipment or charging under the influence of adrenaline, could still be dropped instantly with a single 45 hit. Axis engineers respected its simplicity. Post-war evaluations by German ordnance officers described the 1911 as functional perfection, no wasted motion. It didn't have the refined lines of a Luger, but in combat terms, refinement meant little. Even decades later, nations rebuilding from the war adopted variants or copied its mechanics. Argentina's Ballestero Molina, Norway's Kongsberg Colt, and even China's domestically produced copies bore testimony to the weapon's reach, a design admired even by those it once opposed. The 1911's dominance wasn't about propaganda, it was about results. And in a conflict that spanned continents, that kind of reputation carried weight. The leadership angle, doctrine and philosophy. Every weapon tells you something about its commanders. In the case of the M1911, it revealed how the U.S. military saw its soldiers as individuals whose survival often depended on personal weapons and initiative. During the interwar years, American officers debated modernization. Many argued for smaller calibers, higher capacities, and lighter designs. Yet the Ordnance Department, informed by field experience and conservative in doctrine, stood firm. The 45 ACP and the 1911 had proven their worth. The leadership's philosophy was straightforward. A sidearm wasn't a soldier's main weapon, but when needed, it had to end the fight immediately. The 1911 stopping power ensured that. Generals like George S. Patton, though known for his revolvers, publicly praised the 1911 as the best automatic pistol in service. Even as the war advanced and submachine guns became common, the command insisted the 1911 remain standard issue. The logic was simple. Technology may change, but trust is built on performance. By 1944, the weapon had achieved near-mythic status. Officers posed with it in photographs. Special units like Rangers and paratroopers often carried two, one on the hip, one under the arm. To them, it wasn't outdated, it was insurance. And in the command rooms of the Ordnance Department, reports confirmed what every veteran already knew. This old pistol was still the best tool for the job. The war would soon test that truth under its harshest trials, in hedgerows, jungles, and ruins where men met at point-blank range. There, the pistol would stop being an artifact and once again become a lifeline. And it was in those moments, in firelight and fear, that the M1911's legend truly solidified.
War reveals the truth of machines. On the proving grounds of Normandy, Tarawa, Anzio, and the Ardennes, the Colt M1911 faced its greatest test, not in laboratories or design trials, but in the hands of exhausted, frightened men fighting for inches of earth. 1942. Baptism of Fire. The pistol's reintroduction into global conflict came first in the deserts of North Africa. In the hands of American GIs from Operation Torch, it quickly proved its worth. Tank crews of the 1st Armored Division carried it as standard issue, their confined steel compartments leaving little room for rifles. When German forces overran Allied armor near Kasserine Pass in February 1943, survivors recalled using the 1911 to fight their way clear of burning vehicles.
In those suffocating, oil-slicked interiors, it wasn't a sidearm. It was survival in 8 pounds of steel and ammunition. Reports from Tunisia told the same story. The weapon fired when nothing else could. Dust, heat, and neglect didn't stop it. One Army ordnance officer wrote simply, "No better close weapon in service." 1943. The Pacific Jumble. Thousands of miles away in the tangled nightmare of the Solomon Islands, the 1911 earned its fearsome Pacific reputation. The humidity-corroded rifles, sand-clogged bolts, but the pistol's open design let it keep fighting. In night assaults, when Japanese soldiers infiltrated perimeters with bayonets and grenades, the .45 became a defender's best friend. Marines learned to sleep with it in hand, thumb resting on the safety. Many would later say it was the most comforting weight they knew. At Tarawa, the battle that turned 76 hours into eternity, the 1911's brutal efficiency was on full display. Marines clearing bunkers used it at arm's length, firing point-blank in spaces no rifle could reach. Its heavy rounds ended fights instantly. Navy corpsmen, often unarmed by regulation, quietly carried captured 1911s for protection. They had seen what happened when the enemy broke through, and they wanted a weapon they could trust. 1944. Europe and the hedgerows. When the Allies landed in Normandy, every paratrooper carried one. It was standard issue for the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, holstered on the hip or strapped to the chest in a shoulder rig. In the chaos of the D-Day drops, many men were separated from their primary weapons. Their pistols were the only thing between them and capture. At Sainte-Mère-Église, paratroopers of the 505th used 1911s in brutal close-quarters fighting. In one recorded engagement, Sergeant John Ray, wounded and pinned under debris, used his .45 to kill an advancing German before succumbing himself. His pistol was later found empty, the slide locked open. That was the 1911's reality. Not glory, just trust in steel. Throughout the Normandy campaign, its compact form made it invaluable for reconnaissance units and engineers who often fought from vehicles or tight urban spaces. In hedgerow combat, where visibility vanished and ambushes came from 10 feet away, it was a weapon made for instinct, not distance. Even general officers carried it in the field. Brigadier General James Gavin of the 82nd Airborne preferred his M1911 over any revolver, saying it was the soldier's equalizer. 1944. Italy and Anzio. In Italy, as Allied troops fought up the peninsula, the 1911 appeared everywhere, in the hands of infantrymen, medics, and pilots alike. At Anzio, German artillery pounded the beachhead relentlessly. When positions were overrun, pistol combat was often all that remained. One veteran recalled a desperate defense of a field hospital, where orderlies and wounded soldiers fought off attackers using 1911s scavenged from fallen comrades. They held until reinforcements arrived. It was one of countless small moments lost to the greater narrative of war, but each a testament to the weapon's presence wherever men refused to yield. 1945. The final push. By the time U.S. forces reached Germany, the 1911 was everywhere. In the ruins of Aachen, in tank turrets rolling toward Berlin, in bomber cockpits flying over the Rhine. For many, it had become an extension of the uniform, a final assurance that no matter what, they were not defenseless. At the Battle of the Bulge, the last great German offensive of the war, temperatures dropped below freezing. Lubricants froze, rifles jammed, but the 1911, with its generous tolerances and slow-moving slide, continued to function.
Soldiers wrapped them in socks to keep them warm, then drew them when German paratroopers attacked in white camouflage under snow-laden trees. By now, even skeptics within the military understood. This antique sidearm had outlasted every trend, every doubt. It had gone from relic to legend. And as the war reached its closing months, the 1911's role would expand again into the hands of America's most elite fighters, men operating behind enemy lines where a weapon's failure meant death.
Behind enemy lines, the Shadow War. By 1944, the M1911 was not just a standard-issue sidearm, it was the weapon of choice for men who worked in silence. The Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the forerunner of the CIA, armed its field agents and saboteurs with it almost exclusively. Their missions took them behind German and Japanese lines, where stealth and reliability were everything. The OSS modified many of their .45s, adding sound suppressors, shortening barrels, machining slides for easier concealment. These were not mass-produced weapons, they were hand-tuned instruments for special operations. When an agent carried a suppressed 1911 into occupied France or Burma, he knew one truth: it would fire when he needed it most. Specialized units like Army Rangers, Marine Raiders, and airborne pathfinders also favored the pistol. Its combination of stopping power and compactness made it ideal for close-quarters raids, tunnel fighting, and clearing trenches. A 1944 report from the 1st Ranger Battalion described the weapon as unfailing, even after days without cleaning. In jungle operations where maintenance was impossible, that reliability meant survival. The paratroopers' pistol. For paratroopers, the 1911 was both companion and contingency. Before every airborne operation, men checked their harnesses, ammo, and maps, and finally, their pistol. It was the one weapon guaranteed to stay with them after the drop. In the chaos of Operation Market Garden, when drops scattered the 101st Airborne across the Dutch countryside, isolated troopers fought entire engagements armed only with their sidearms.
Behind enemy lines, the Shadow War. By 1944, the M1911 was not just a standard-issue sidearm. It was the weapon of choice for men who worked in silence. The Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, the forerunner of the CIA, armed its field agents and saboteurs with it almost exclusively. Their missions took them behind German and Japanese lines, where stealth and reliability were everything. The OSS modified many of their .45s, adding sound suppressors, shortening barrels, machining slides for easier concealment. These were not mass-produced weapons. They were hand-tuned instruments for special operations. When an agent carried a suppressed 1911 into occupied France or Burma, he knew one truth: it would fire when he needed it most. Specialized units like Army Rangers, Marine Raiders, and airborne pathfinders also favored the pistol. Its combination of stopping power and compactness made it ideal for close-quarters raids, tunnel fighting, and clearing trenches. A 1944 report from the 1st Ranger Battalion described the weapon as unfailing, even after days without cleaning. In jungle operations, where maintenance was impossible, that reliability meant survival. The paratroopers' pistol. By paratroopers, the 1911 was both companion and contingency. Before every airborne operation, men checked their harnesses, ammo, and maps, and finally, their pistol. It was the one weapon guaranteed to stay with them after the drop. In the chaos of Operation Market Garden, when drops scattered the 101st Airborne across the Dutch countryside,
Isolated troopers fought entire engagements, armed only with their sidearms. One after-action report tells of a small group holding a farmhouse outside Eindhoven, using little more than grenades and 45 pistols, holding the line until British armor broke through. The pistol wasn't designed to win battles alone, but it won moments, and moments win wars. The tanker's last line. Inside a Sherman tank, space was measured in inches. There was no room for a rifle. When hatches jammed or flames rose, escape was chaos. Crews often kept their M1911s strapped to the interior walls or wedged near the radio console. If they had to bail out under fire, it was the first thing they grabbed. At the Battle of Aachen in late 1944, tankers of the 3rd Armored Division described fighting through narrow city streets where German soldiers ambushed them with Panzerfausts from basements and windows. When tanks were disabled and crews forced out, pistol fire echoed between the ruins, brief, decisive exchanges, fought at 10 feet or less. It wasn't heroism in those moments, it was instinct. The pistol's compact strength, its balance, its instant readiness, made it a trusted friend when everything else turned to wreckage. The aviator's last defense. In the skies, bomber crews and fighter pilots also carried the M1911. For them, it wasn't a combat weapon, it was insurance. If shot down over enemy territory, the pistol offered at least a fighting chance. Pilots of the 8th Air Force kept them in shoulder holsters beneath flight jackets. Downed aviators in France, aided by the resistance, used them during escapes. In the Pacific, some pilots carried customized versions, with lanyards and extra magazines. A single reliable weapon for survival in hostile jungle or ocean. In both theaters, the message was the same: this pistol will not fail you. The final battles, Okinawa, and the endgame. As 1945 dawned, the Pacific Campaign reached its brutal crescendo. Okinawa became the bloodiest battle of the Pacific. Caves, tunnels, and suicidal charges under endless artillery fire. In the claustrophobic maze of the Shuri Line, the M1911 came into its own once again. Marines clearing enemy positions often fought hand to hand. Their rifles too long, their shotguns empty, they drew their .45s and ended the fight one trigger pull at a time. Combat cameramen captured images of men emerging from smoke-blackened caves, their pistols still smoking, faces hollow from exhaustion. In those images, the M1911 is not an artifact, it is a constant, a piece of unyielding steel amid chaos. When the war finally ended in August 1945, the statistics were staggering. More than 2.7 million M1911 and M1911A1 pistols had been produced. They had served in every branch of the U.S. military, across every continent and ocean. But beyond the numbers was the truth that mattered most. This design, from 1911, had not just survived World War II, it had defined it. It had armed officers and privates, tankers and aviators, spies and engineers. It had been carried through deserts, jungles, and frozen forests. And in it all, the weapon had remained unchanged, a rare constant in a war where everything else evolved by necessity. As the guns fell silent, millions of American servicemen returned home. Many brought with them memories of the pistol that had stood by them in the darkest hours. Many brought the pistols themselves, mementos of trust forged in battle. The 1911 had done more than serve. It had transcended its role. It wasn't just a tool of war anymore. It was a piece of identity, an emblem of the American soldier's will to endure. But war never truly ends for its weapons, and the 1911 story would not close with peace. Its steel would continue to echo through new conflicts, new generations, and new technologies, proving that perfection, once achieved, has no expiration date.
The war had ended, but the 1911 refused to rest. When the guns of World War II fell silent in 1945, millions of service pistols were shipped home, stored in armories, or issued to the newly occupying forces across Europe and Asia. Yet no one in the U.S. military considered replacing them. There was no need. The weapon that had begun its service under President Taft was now entering the atomic age, unchanged. Post-war America, the veteran's weapon. Returning soldiers carried stories, medals, and memories. Many carried their faith in the pistol that had saved them. Surplus 1911s flooded the civilian market, sold cheaply through government programs or passed down through veterans' families. They became fixtures in police departments, competitive shooting ranges, and private collections. By the 1950s, the M1911A1 was both a military standard and a cultural icon. In films, war stories, and post-war propaganda, it symbolized the grit of the American GI. It appeared on recruiting posters and in the hands of every officer in Hollywood's depictions of the war. But beyond nostalgia, the pistol continued to serve. Korea, the frozen proving ground. In June 1950, the Korean War reignited combat on a scale few expected so soon after World War II. The same pistols that had fought through Europe were unboxed, reissued, and carried into a new theater, this time in sub-zero temperatures and mountainous terrain. The 1911 handled the cold with the same indifference it had shown to heat and sand. Its large tolerances meant ice and frost rarely jammed it. Soldiers in Korea praised it for its predictable recoil and absolute dependability. Once again, tankers, officers, and special detachments carried it with confidence. The .45 ACP round remained unmatched in close-quarters combat, especially in trench skirmishes that echoed those of the First World War decades earlier. It was there, amid snow and silence, that the weapon proved its age was irrelevant. The men carrying it were new, but their trust in it was inherited. Vietnam, the jungle reclaims the legend. 15 years later, the 1911 returned to war again, this time in the humid, unforgiving jungles of Southeast Asia. By the mid-1960s, the pistol was still standard issue for most officers, pilots, and special units. Though the M16 rifle symbolized modern warfare, the sidearm remained a reminder that reliability sometimes outweighed innovation. In Vietnam, the 1911 once again became the soldier's safeguard in close combat. Helicopter crews wore it strapped to their flight vests. Tunnel rats, the brave volunteers who crawled through Viet Cong tunnel networks, carried it as their only weapon. For them, the short barrel, immediate firepower, and devastating .45 slug were irreplaceable. SEAL teams and Special Forces units preferred it over lighter, higher-capacity pistols. Its stopping power and ease of maintenance under field conditions made it a natural choice. Many customized their issued pistols, filing sights, tuning triggers, or fitting suppressors, yet always keeping the same mechanism intact. Combat footage from Vietnam shows the 1911 still in its familiar leather holsters, still caked in mud, still doing exactly what it had done in 1911. Fire when everything else failed. Decades had passed, wars had changed, but the pistol's place in America's arsenal had not. By the early 1970s, some in the Pentagon questioned whether the .45 should finally be replaced. NATO standardization and advances in small arms pointed toward lighter, higher-capacity sidearms chambered in 9mm. But within the ranks, resistance was strong. To those who carried it, the 1911 wasn't just a firearm, it was a legacy, a piece of continuity stretching from below wood to caisson.
And though political and logistical pressures would eventually force change, the weapon's reputation would not fade. It had survived 2 world wars and now 3 decades of continuous service. It had crossed from history into legend. But the next chapter would test not its performance, but its endurance, in an era that believed old steel could finally be replaced by new science.
The age of change and refusal to die. By the late 1970s, the world had changed beyond recognition. Jet aircraft, nuclear deterrence, computers, and satellites defined a new era of warfare. But in the holsters of U.S. servicemen, one relic remained: the Colt M1911 A1. It was older than most of the men carrying it, and yet it refused to leave. The U.S. military began serious trials to replace the pistol, seeking a standardized 9mm sidearm to align with NATO allies. The logic was clear. A smaller cartridge meant lighter recoil, larger magazine capacity, and simplified logistics. But inside the ranks, especially among Marine and Special Operations communities, there was deep resistance. Many argued the .45 stopping power was non-negotiable, that no lighter round could match its terminal effect. When the official replacement trials began in the early 1980s, most of the world's major pistol manufacturers submitted designs. The winner was the Beretta 92F, adopted as the M9 in 1985. After 74 years of service, the U.S. formally retired the 1911. Or so it seemed. The 1911 in the modern battlefield. Even as the M9 entered production, many elite units refused to part with their .45s. Marine Force Recon, Delta Force, and elements of the Army's Special Forces quietly continued to issue the 1911, rebuilt, tuned, and modernized. The Marine Corps' MEU SOC pistol became legendary, hand-built from surplus World War II frames, refurbished with new barrels, safeties, and night sights. These were not museum pieces, they were fighting tools, meticulously maintained for men who demanded total reliability. Operators trusted it because it delivered, fast, accurate, and devastating at close range. Even in the sands of Iraq and the mountains of Afghanistan decades later, the 1911 was still there, now equipped with modern grips, rails, and tactical enhancements. A weapon born in the age of horses and biplanes was still drawing blood in the age of drones and night vision. Cultural immortality. While its military role diminished, the 1911 found a second life in civilian hands. It became the foundation of modern competitive shooting. Champions like Jeff Cooper built entire doctrines around it. The modern technique of pistolcraft was shaped by the .45. Law enforcement agencies across the U.S. continued to use it, especially SWAT teams and federal units who valued its accuracy and stopping power. Custom gunsmiths refined the platform into an art form. Polished slides, match-grade barrels, tuned triggers so crisp they broke like glass. Movies, too, immortalized it. From Patton and Saving Ryan Private to Black Hawk Down, the 1911 became shorthand for professionalism, confidence, and American resolve. In the hands of cinematic heroes and real soldiers alike, it represented not just a weapon, but an attitude. The Return, M45A1 and the Enduring Legacy. In 2012, more than a century after its introduction, the U.S. Marine Corps officially adopted a modernized version, the Colt M45A1 close-quarter battle pistol. Finished in desert tan Cerakote, equipped with a rail system and Novak sights, it was the 1911 reborn for the 21st century. The Marines called it a proven performer. It served in Afghanistan alongside M4 carbines and modern optics, a symbol that even after 100 years, the old design still had a place on the modern battlefield.
In 2017, when the U.S. Army began issuing the Sig Sauer M17 and M18 as new sidearms, the decision marked yet another generational shift. Yet even then, small units continued to request the 1911. Some for familiarity, some for respect, others because, simply put, it still worked. A weapon that should have been a relic had instead become timeless. A century of trust. More than 110 years since its adoption, the M1911 continues to serve across the world, in military reserve units, in law enforcement, and in civilian defense. Few designs in history can claim such longevity. It has outlasted empires, witnessed 6 generations of war, and remains instantly recognizable. The deep-blued finish, the heavy slide, the unmistakable bark of the .45. But perhaps its endurance is not mechanical at all. It is human. A soldier's trust cannot be engineered by committee or replaced by technology. It is earned, one round at a time, across decades and continents. The 1911 earned that trust long ago, and somehow, even today, it still carries it. The weapon that began as a response to failure became something far greater. Through 2 world wars, a dozen smaller conflicts, and over a century of service, it outlived the men who first carried it. It spanned the evolution of warfare, from trench lines to drone strikes, yet never lost its place in a soldier's hands. Its endurance wasn't luck, nor nostalgia. It was the product of a simple truth. Good design serves the user, not the moment. The pistol's lines, flat, functional, unapologetic, tell the story of a weapon built for survival, not spectacle. Each one carried by men who trusted steel more than promises. From the mud of Normandy to the heat of Da Nang, it was the same voice in their holsters, deep, confident, final. Technology moved forward. Calibers changed, materials lightened. But the principles that made the 1911 endure remain the benchmark against which all others are measured. Even today, a century later, new pistols are compared to it, not the other way around. That is its quiet victory. It reminds us that progress is not always about replacement. Sometimes it is about refinement. And that in a world obsessed with innovation, true perfection might already have been achieved once in 1911. For every soldier who carried it, every gunsmith who rebuilt it, and every historian who studies its form, the M1911 is more than metal. It is memory forged in steel. A sidearm that became a companion, a design that became doctrine, and a relic that refused to die. Over 100 years later, the sound of its slide, that heavy, deliberate click, still echoes across firing ranges and war zones alike. A century of faith, still chambered in .45.